We begin, as we always do, with a woman who had almost nothing left to lose. At 41 years old, Ruth Calloway stood on the frozen platform of the Larkspur Junction depot with $11 sewn into the lining of her coat and no roof she could call her own. It was her husband's cousin, a banker named Elias Vance, who had called in a note on her farm not 6 weeks after Thomas Calloway was laid in the ground, telling her, with the practiced gentleness of a man who has done this before, that business was business, and grief did not excuse a debt. So she had walked away from the only home she had known in 11 years of marriage, carrying a carpet bag, a father's old toolbox, and a silence too heavy for tears. When the railyard auctioneer called out a battered, padlocked cargo car that no one could open and no one wanted, rusting on a dead siding behind the depot, Ruth raised her hand before she had fully decided to, and bought it for $4. The men around her laughed. It seemed the final, foolish act of a woman with nothing left to protect. But sealed inside that car was something that had waited 50 years to be found, a secret that would not only mend Ruth Calloway's broken life, but would finally set right a wrong the whole town of Larkspur Junction had spent half a century trying to forget. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ruth Calloway. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten, tell us where you're from in the comments. We'd love to know we're not so far apart after all. Ruth had been raised to believe that nothing broken was ever truly finished. Her father, Jonas Pruitt, ran the wheelwright's shop at the edge of Cassidy's Ford, a modest river town in western Missouri where the Katy line had not yet reached when Ruth was a girl, and where a cracked axle or a split wagon tongue could mean the difference between a harvest sold and a harvest lost in the mud. Jonas was not a sentimental man, but he had a philosophy he repeated so often that it became, in time, the marrow of his daughter's character. Any fool can throw a thing away, he would say. Working iron with the slow patience of a man who trusted his hands more than his temper, but it takes a clever soul to see what a thing still has left to give. Ruth grew up in the smoke and ring of that shop, handing him tools before he asked for them, learning the grain of wood and the temper of metal. And by the time she was 12 she could true a wagon wheel herself, could tell by the sound of a hinge whether it wanted oil or replacing, could look at a heap of what other children called junk and see, instead, a puzzle waiting for the right hands. Her mother, Alma, had died when Ruth was 9, and it was perhaps this early loss that gave Ruth her particular tenderness toward things and people the world had decided to stop looking at. She remembered, all her life, how her father had kept her mother's sewing basket exactly as Alma left it, needles threaded, a shirt half mended. Not because he could not bear to finish the work but because he could not bear to admit it was unfinished. Ruth finished it herself, at 10 years old, sitting up late by lamplight with her mother's thimble loose on her small finger. And something in that act, taking up what had been abandoned and carrying it through to its proper end, settled into her like a second nature. She met Thomas Calloway when she was 22, a quiet, sturdy young farmer from just outside Larkspur Junction who had come to Cassidy's Ford to have a broken plow beam repaired and stayed to court the blacksmith's daughter instead. Thomas was not a man of grand speeches. He courted her the way he did everything else, steadily, without hurry, bringing her small kindnesses, a jar of his mother's preserves, a book he had traded 3 days' labor to borrow, until Ruth understood that this was simply how he loved, in increments, the way a river wears a stone smooth rather than all at once. They married in the spring of 1885 and took up a rented farm 2 miles outside Larkspur Junction, in the shadow of the low green hills that rolled down toward the rail line. And for 13 years they built, slowly and without much money, a life that suited them both, Thomas working the fields, Ruth mending harness and furniture and clocks and reputations. For she had become, in that time, the woman in the county everyone brought their broken things to, trusting her hands the way her father had once trusted his own. They had no children who lived past infancy, a grief they carried quietly and did not often speak of, folding it instead into the care they gave everything else, the orchard Thomas grafted from cast-off cuttings other farmers threw over their fences, the parlor furniture Ruth restored from pieces salvaged at estate sales, even the stray dogs and lame horses that found their way, somehow, always, to the Calloway gate. Neighbors said there was something almost holy in the way that farm took in what nobody else wanted and made it whole again. Ruth did not think of it as holiness. She thought of it as the only inheritance her father had truly left her, not land, not money, but the conviction that value was never destroyed, only misplaced, and that someone, somewhere, needed to go looking for it. It was this conviction, more than any other single thing, that would carry her through the year that took everything else away. The unraveling began, as it so often does, with an illness that seemed at first no worse than a bad cold. Thomas caught a fever in the wet autumn of 1897, the kind that swept through river towns most years and usually passed within a week. It did not pass. By the time Dr. Wren from Larkspur Junction admitted that this was typhoid and not influenza, Thomas had been sweating through his second week of fever. And Ruth had not slept more than 2 hours together in 9 days, sponging his skin with water she carried up from the well herself because she trusted no one else's hands near him. He died on the 11th night of November, with Ruth's fingers wrapped around his, and the last thing he said to her, in a voice gone thin as paper, was that she was not to let the orchard go. Because a tree that had been grafted and tended for 10 years was worth more alive than any man's ready cash. She promised him she would not. It was a promise she would not, in the end, be permitted to keep. The farm, it emerged in the weeks after the funeral, had never been fully Thomas's to leave her. He had taken a loan against the land some years earlier to buy seed after a bad harvest, a loan held not by some distant institution but by the Larkspur Junction Trust and Savings, and by extension, by its president, a cousin of Thomas's on his mother's side named Elias Vance. Ruth had met Elias perhaps a dozen times over the years at church suppers and county fairs, a smooth, well-dressed man with a banker's handshake, warm on the surface and cool underneath, who had always spoken to her with a kind of careful courtesy that she understood only later to be the courtesy men extend to those they intend, eventually, to disappoint. 6 weeks after Thomas was buried, Elias called at the farm himself, sat in her parlor with his hat on his knee, and explained, in tones of genuine seeming regret, that the note was overdue. That the bank's obligations to its own depositors left him no room for further patience, and that he would need the balance in full by the new year or the farm would be sold to satisfy the debt. Ruth asked him, quietly, whether 13 years of marriage and a dead husband bought no grace at all. Elias told her that grace was a fine thing for church, but a poor foundation for a bank ledger. She fought it the only way a woman of her position could. She sold what furniture she could bear to part with, restored and resold 3 broken clocks and a walnut writing desk she had found at an estate sale years before. Wrote to a cousin in Kansas City who never answered, and stood before Judge Pemberton in the county courthouse to ask for more time. Only to learn that the note had been drawn in a way that left the court very little room to grant her any. By the second week of January 1898, the farm was sold at auction to a cattleman from 2 counties over, the orchard Thomas had begged her to save going with it. And Ruth Calloway walked away from the only home of her married life with a carpet bag, her father's old toolbox, which she had kept through every sale. Unable to part with the one thing that was truly, indisputably hers, and $11 sewn carefully into the lining of her coat, all that remained of 13 years of shared labor. She did not go to Kansas City. She did not go anywhere in particular. She simply began walking toward the Larkspur Junction depot, because a depot, she reasoned, was a place where a person with almost nothing could still, in theory, go somewhere else. And because the toolbox in her hand was heavy, and she needed, for a little while, somewhere to sit down. It was behind that depot, on a rail spur so overgrown with sumac and ragweed that most travelers never noticed it existed. That the rail yard held its irregular auctions of abandoned rolling stock, cars whose owners had defaulted on storage fees, or vanished. Or simply never come back for freight nobody remembered shipping. Ruth had wandered toward the noise of the auctioneer's voice more from a lack of anywhere else to be than from any real intention. And she arrived just as a heavy-set man named Higgins was working his way, without much enthusiasm, through the least promising lot of the day, a squat, iron-strapped cargo car. Its wood siding grayed and split with age, its wheels rusted fast to the rails beneath it, and its door secured by an enormous, ancient padlock so thoroughly fused with corrosion that Higgins announced with a grim sort of humor, 3 different men had already tried and failed to force it, and he was selling the whole car as is, contents unknown, buyer's risk entirely. Nobody wanted it. A car that could not even be opened was worth less than the scrap iron holding it shut. And the small crowd of farmers and merchants had already begun drifting toward the livelier lots of harness and tools. Ruth stood at the edge of the gathering with her father's toolbox at her feet, looking at that stubborn, sealed door. And felt something stir in her that she would later struggle to explain to anyone who asked, not hope, exactly, because she had none left to spare, but a kind of old, familiar recognition. The same thing she had felt her whole life looking at broken clocks and cracked axles and stray dogs nobody else wanted. Any fool can throw a thing away. Higgins called for $4, more as a formality than an expectation, and Ruth Calloway, with $11 to her name and nowhere to sleep that night, heard her own voice say, quite calmly, that she would take it. The men nearby laughed, not unkindly, the way people laugh at a small, sad joke. A woman with nothing, spending nearly half of it on a locked box she could not even open. Higgins himself asked her, not unsympathetically, whether she was quite certain, and Ruth, surprising herself, said that she had spent her whole life being the only person willing to look twice at something everyone else had given up on. And she did not see any reason to stop now simply because her own circumstances had grown thin. She paid her $4. The car, along with whatever small patch of siding it occupied, was hers. It took her the better part of 2 days to open it. The padlock itself proved, in the end, to be less of an obstacle than its situation suggested. Ruth's father had taught her that rust was rarely as final as it looked. And after soaking the mechanism in oil borrowed from the depot's lamp stores and working it patiently with a thin file from her toolbox, she felt the ancient tumblers give, reluctantly. On the second evening, while the depot agent, a kind, curious young man named Silas Boone, held a lantern for her against the coming dark. The door itself resisted longer, swollen shut with decades of weather, and it was Silas who finally helped her lever it open with an iron bar. The two of them throwing their weight against it until it shrieked outward on hinges that had not moved since before either of them was born. The smell that came out to meet them was not the smell of ordinary abandonment, not simply dust and mildew, but something drier, older, oddly preserved. Like the inside of a cedar chest sealed shut for a lifetime. The car's interior was mostly bare, floorboards silvered with age, but along the far wall Ruth's lantern light caught something that made her stop breathing for a moment. A section of the wall that did not sit quite flush with the rest, a seam too straight and too deliberate to be ordinary where, as though someone, long ago, had built a second false wall inside the first. Carved into one of the boards near the floor, worn nearly smooth by time but still legible if you tilted the lantern just so, were 2 initials, AC. And beneath them, so faint she had to trace it with her fingertip to be certain it was truly there, a single word, remember. Silas Boone, young and unable to help himself, asked her what in the world she thought it meant. Ruth did not answer him right away. She was thinking of her father, of a lifetime spent believing that nothing broken was ever truly finished, and she was thinking, too, with a strange, quiet certainty she could not have explained, that whatever waited behind that false wall had been waiting a very long time for someone willing to look. It took her another full day to work the false wall free, prying gently at the seams with tools meant for far gentler work. Careful not to destroy whatever lay behind it before she even had the chance to see it. When the boards finally came away, what she found inside was not treasure in the way the word is usually meant, no chest of gleaming coins spilling into lantern light, but something that would, in time, prove far more valuable than gold, a narrow hidden compartment, dry and undisturbed, holding a tin dispatch box gone soft with rust at its corners. A bundle of letters tied with a ribbon long faded to no color at all, a leather-bound ledger swollen with damp air but its pages, remarkably, still whole, and folded on top of everything else. A quilt, hand-stitched in a pattern Ruth did not recognize, its colors dimmed but its careful, deliberate geometry still plainly, purposefully strange. She carried it all back to the small room she had taken above Widow Hutchins's boarding house, the only lodging her remaining dollars could afford her, and it was there, by a single oil lamp. That Ruth Calloway began to understand what she had truly bought for $4. The ledger was the first thing she opened, and the first name written inside its cover, in a strong, careful hand, was Abram Cole. Ruth did not know the name, but the date beneath it, the 18th of March, 1852, told her at once that whatever this was, it predated her own lifetime by decades. Predated even her father's arrival in Missouri. The pages that followed were not, as she had half expected, an ordinary account of goods and debts. They were entries of names, dates, and small, coded notations, a list, she slowly realized, of people, dozens of them. Recorded not as property or cargo but as souls passed safely along some invisible road, with notes beside certain entries that made her hands go cold, reached Alton safe. Sent north with Marsh. Held at the car 3 nights, moved on the 14th. The letters, when she untied them with trembling fingers, confirmed what the ledger had only suggested, correspondence between a man signing himself only as AC. And allies scattered from Missouri to Illinois, coded in careful, guarded language, discussing the movement of people the writers dared not name outright. Referring instead to parcels and packages and freight that needed carrying safely to its destination. Ruth sat with those letters until the lamp burned low, understanding, by slow and humbling degrees, that the cargo car she had bought as a joke, as a desperate woman's foolish $4 gesture, had once served as a hidden station on the road that fugitive men and women had walked, decades before the war that finally freed them, toward whatever freedom could be found north of the river. Abram Cole, she gathered from the letters, had been a free black blacksmith working the rail lines through Larkspur Junction in the 1850s, trusted by the railroad for his craft and, precisely because of that trust, positioned to move an abandoned or disused car onto a quiet siding whenever the need arose, its false wall built by his own hands to hide. For a night or two at a time, those the ledger so carefully and so tenderly recorded. But it was the quilt that told her the rest, and it was Mercy Jennings, an elderly woman Ruth met the following week through the offices of the same young depot agent who had helped pry open the car, who explained to her what the pattern meant. Mercy was in her 70s, small and sharp-eyed, living in the modest, close-knit neighborhood at the eastern edge of Larkspur Junction that the town's white residents called, without much thought, Cole's Bottom, and that its own residents called, with considerably more pride, Freedom Row. Mercy took one look at the quilt Ruth carried to her, and her hands went still upon it the way hands go still around something sacred. That pattern, Mercy told her, was her own grandfather's work. Abram Cole had been her grandfather, and the quilt was no ordinary bed cover but a map. Its blocks and knots encoding safe houses and river crossings the way certain quilts were said to have done all along that hidden road. Though most who had ever known how to read one were long since gone. Mercy's voice, when she spoke of her grandfather, carried a grief that had clearly never fully healed. Abram Cole, she said, had vanished from Larkspur Junction in the autumn of 1854. And the family had never learned exactly what became of him, whether he had been caught at last by slave catchers who worked the rail lines watching for exactly such a man, or had simply fled north himself once his work grew too dangerous to continue, or had died quietly and been buried without ceremony by neighbors too frightened to speak of how. What Mercy did know, what had been passed down to her like an ember kept carefully alive across 50 years, was that her grandfather had, in his last years in Larkspur Junction, been gathering funds, donations from black tradesmen and a handful of sympathetic white allies alike, toward what the family had always called simply the Freedom Fund. Money meant to purchase the liberty of relatives still held in bondage downriver, and later, the ledger's final pages suggested, repurposed toward buying land for freed families once the war finally, belatedly, made that liberty the law rather than the exception. When Abram Cole disappeared, the fund disappeared with him, and the community that had trusted him with their hard-won savings had spent 50 years believing it simply lost, along with the man who kept it. It was the tin dispatch box, its rusted clasp finally forced open by Ruth's careful hands, that answered the last of the mystery, though the answer brought with it a fresh and heavier weight. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had kept the damp mostly at bay, lay gold coin amounting to a sum that made Ruth's breath catch even in her own reduced circumstances. Enough. She understood immediately, to matter enormously to the modest, struggling households of Freedom Row, and beneath the coin, a final letter, dated the 9th of October, 1854, in Abram Cole's own hand. Addressed to no one in particular and everyone at once, explaining that he had learned a man was watching the rail spur too closely, a bounty hunter working. The letter specified with a bitterness Ruth could feel across 50 years, on behalf of a local landholder eager for the reward money such captures paid, a man named Bartholomew Vance. Ruth read that name twice to be certain her eyes had not deceived her, and felt the whole shape of her own misfortune shift unexpectedly into a larger, older pattern. Bartholomew Vance, she would learn from Mercy and later from the yellowed newspapers kept in the back room of the Larkspur Junction courthouse, had been one of the town's founding landholders. A man whose considerable fortune, family legend always maintained rather vaguely, had come from shrewd early investment in rail-adjacent property. What the letter suggested, and what Mercy confirmed with the flat, weary certainty of someone whose family had always half known and never been able to prove it, was that a meaningful portion of that fortune had in fact come from bounty payments for captured fugitives, and that Bartholomew Vance, once his slave-catching profits had purchased him respectability, had spent the years after the war quietly buying up, through predatory loans and manipulated deeds, much of the very land that freed families in Cole's Bottom had struggled to claim for themselves, the very same pattern of debt and dispossession, Ruth realized with a cold shock of recognition. That had just cost her her own farm. Bartholomew Vance's grandson was Elias Vance, president of the Larkspur Junction Trust and Savings, the man who now held, among his bank's many quiet holdings, the mortgage papers on nearly every remaining household in Freedom Row. Ruth did not sleep at all that night. She sat with the ledger, the letters, the coin, and the quilt spread before her on Widow Hutchins's narrow bed, and understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who has already lost everything and therefore has very little left to fear, that she had not simply found an old man's forgotten savings. She had found the other half of a debt that Elias Vance's family had been quietly collecting on for 50 years, and never once repaying. She went to Elias Vance first, before she went to anyone else, believing, in her own good faith, that a fair man confronted plainly with old wrongs might choose to set them right without needing to be forced. She was wrong, and the meeting taught her a good deal about the particular kind of courage the coming weeks would demand of her. Elias received her in his office at the bank with the same smooth, careful courtesy he had shown her in her own parlor months before. Listened to her account of the ledger and the letters and the coin with an expression that gave away almost nothing, and then informed her, once she had finished, that whatever an old freedman's private papers might allege about events 50 years gone, they carried no legal standing whatsoever against deeds properly filed and mortgages properly executed. And that he would thank her, as a matter of both law and Christian charity, not to go stirring up old grievances that could only cause pain to families on both sides of the color line who had long since made their peace with the past. Ruth told him, quietly, that she did not believe Freedom Row had made any peace at all, only endured what it had no power to change, and that endurance was not the same thing as peace. Elias's expression cooled considerably at that, and he reminded her, in tones no longer quite so warm, that she was a woman alone, without land, without standing, and without, so far as the bank's records showed, any legal claim whatsoever to property found inside a car she herself admitted she had never fully inspected before purchase, a car, he pointed out, that the railroad might yet argue had never rightfully been hers to open at all. It was, Ruth understood as she left his office, a threat dressed as a caution, and it told her a great deal about how frightened Elias Vance truly was of what she carried. She went next to Mercy Jennings and the families of Freedom Row, not to claim any authority over what she had found but to lay the whole of it honestly before the people to whom it truly belonged. It was Mercy who insisted, over Ruth's own hesitation, that the discovery could do no good hidden away a second time. And it was Mercy who first suggested that the matter be brought before Judge Pemberton and the town itself, publicly. Where Elias Vance's careful denials would have to be spoken aloud in front of witnesses rather than murmured privately across a desk. The families of Freedom Row, cautious after generations of learning exactly how little the town's official channels had ever done for them, argued long into several evenings about the wisdom of trusting the courthouse with a truth that implicated one of the town's most powerful men, and it was Ruth. A white widow with nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left for Elias Vance to threaten her with, who finally offered to be the one to bring the ledger before the judge, so that the risk, whatever it proved to be, would fall on shoulders that had already been emptied of everything but resolve. Elias Vance did not take the news of the coming hearing quietly. In the days before it, Ruth found herself the subject of quiet, coordinated unkindness that she recognized, even then, as the particular cruelty of the comfortable toward those who threaten their comfort. Widow Hutchins was visited by a bank officer suggesting, with regret, that certain arrangements regarding the boarding house's own small loan might need reconsidering if undesirable tenants continued to be sheltered there. The county freight office suddenly discovered irregularities in the sale of the cargo car that required Ruth to answer several unnecessary questions, and a rumor began circulating, traceable to no one in particular, that the widow Calloway had lost her wits along with her farm and was troubling respectable families with wild stories about a dead man's buried gold. Ruth bore all of it with the same steady patience her father had once shown a stubborn Axel, understanding that a lie repeated with confidence often looks, for a while, remarkably like the truth. And that her only defense was simply to keep walking forward with the ledger held plainly in the light. The hearing was held on a bright, cold morning in late February, in the same courthouse where Ruth had once stood asking Judge Pemberton for mercy she had not been granted. And this time the room was crowded, farmers and merchants curious about the rumors, and, filling the back rows with a quiet dignity that made Ruth's throat tighten. Nearly every family from Freedom Row, Mercy Jennings seated at the very front with the quilt folded carefully in her lap. Ruth laid the ledger, the letters, and Abram Cole's final testimony before the judge and read aloud, in a voice she willed steady, the entries that named Bartholomew Vance as the bounty hunter's patron and the letters that described, in Abram Cole's own careful hand, the fear of a man who knew he was being watched. Elias Vance, seated with his lawyer near the front, argued precisely what Ruth had expected him to argue, that old accusations proved nothing. That his grandfather's business dealings were a matter of public record and entirely legal, that the ledger of a man dead 50 years could not overturn deeds properly filed in the county courthouse. It was Mercy Jennings who answered him, rising unbidden from her seat at the front of the room, unfolding the quilt across her lap for the whole courtroom to see, and speaking not with anger but with the calm, unbearable patience of someone who has waited her entire life for a hearing she never truly expected to receive. She told the judge and the gathered town what the quilt's pattern meant, what her grandfather had risked to keep it, and what her family and a dozen others like it had lost. Generation after generation, first to men like Bartholomew Vance who had hunted human beings for profit, and later to the quieter, more respectable theft of loans structured to fail and land quietly absorbed into the Vance family's holdings. She did not ask the judge for gold. She asked him only to look, honestly, at deeds the family had always suspected were built on a foundation the town had simply agreed, for 50 years, not to examine too closely. Judge Pemberton, to his credit, did examine them, ordering the county's own property records brought forward and compared against the dates and names in Abram Cole's ledger. And what emerged over the following weeks, slowly and with considerably more resistance from the bank's lawyers than from the facts themselves, was a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Parcels in Freedom Row repeatedly refinanced under terms that all but guaranteed eventual default. Each foreclosure quietly absorbed by Vance family holdings, the very mechanism, Ruth realized with a grim and private recognition, that had cost her the Calloway farm as well, though through Elias's own hand rather than his grandfather's. Faced finally with public scrutiny he could not smooth away with a banker's courtesy, and with the town's own newspaper now reporting the story with a curiosity that made quiet denial impossible. Elias Vance found his careful reputation crumbling far faster than any court could formally dismantle it. Depositors began withdrawing their trust along with their funds. The bank's board, more concerned with its own survival than with loyalty to its president, quietly pressed Elias to resign before the situation worsened further, and within the month he had done so. Retreating from Larkspur Junction altogether to live, it was said, on the remains of a fortune considerably diminished by the very truth he had tried so hard to bury a second time. Justice, in the end, did not arrive as punishment so much as unraveling, a man's careful respectability coming apart, thread by thread. Precisely because he had spent so long depending on no one ever pulling at it. Ruth took no satisfaction in his ruin, but she took a quiet, settled peace in knowing that the truth, once uncovered, had done its own work without her needing to wish anyone ill. The gold that Abram Cole had gathered so carefully, and the far greater sum realized once the county was compelled to void the fraudulent liens and return clear title to the families of Freedom Row, did not go into Ruth's own pocket, though she would have been entitled, by any reasonable account, to a considerable share of it as the one who found and defended it. She asked instead that the fund be used precisely as Abram Cole himself had intended it 50 years before, to secure and improve what freedom the families of Cole's Bottom had already won at such cost. Restoring clear ownership of homes long clouded by uncertain debt, and building, with what remained, a modest schoolhouse for the neighborhood's children, its cornerstone engraved. At Mercy Jennings's quiet insistence, with a single word taken from the boards of the old cargo car, remember. Ruth herself accepted only what the community, in its own considerable pride, insisted upon offering her in return, a small parcel of land at the edge of Cole's Bottom where she built a modest workshop. Mending harness and furniture and clocks for anyone in Larkspur Junction willing to bring their broken things to a woman who had once been given up on herself, and had refused, in turn, to give up on what other people threw away. And so we return, as we so often do, to where this story began, to a widow standing on a frozen platform with $11 and nowhere left to go. Spending nearly half of what remained on a locked cargo car that every sensible person around her called a fool's purchase. We call her, still, simply Ruth Calloway, because that was the whole of her strength, and it proved, in the end, to be enough. She did not open that car looking for treasure. She opened it because her father had taught her that nothing broken is ever truly finished, that value is never destroyed, only misplaced, waiting for someone patient enough to go looking for it. What she found inside was not merely gold, though there was gold, and not merely a mystery, though the mystery was real. What she found was 50 years of a wrong quietly compounding in the dark. And the chance, given to very few of us, to be the one who finally lets the light back in. Ruth Calloway lost a farm, a husband, and very nearly her own hope, and what she rebuilt from $4 and a locked door was not simply her own life, but a debt 50 years overdue, finally, quietly, and completely paid. Thank you for sitting with us through Ruth's story tonight, and for giving your evening to a woman who deserved, at long last, to be truly seen. If her patience with broken things moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share this story with someone who might need reminding that nothing forgotten is ever truly worthless. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Until next time, stay close.